How to build muscle optimally? This is a question that countless athletes and non-athletes have asked themselves, and in response, a share of people have developed training philosophies and methodologies, some of them being quite rational, whereas others are outright insane. Too many bodybuilding enthusiasts blindly follow whatever training philosophy their favorite bodybuilder preaches, or whatever is most popular, not able to identify its rationality or irrationality, all because of the lack of understanding of one single thing: the essence of muscle building. Logically, one needs to first understand what hypertrophy is before attempting to find the best way to induce it. Unfortunately, only a small minority of training philosophy and methodology founders acknowledge this, preaching methods of optimal muscle growth, not even understanding why muscle grows in the first place. Soon, you will be able to identify who knows what he's talking about and who doesn't, and you will see how many optimal training methods are being pulled out of mere thin air. So let's start with explaining what the process of muscle growth, aka hypertrophy, even is. It can in fact be summarized very easily. Hypertrophy is the phenomenon of your skeletal muscle mass growing in size as part of an adaptive response to a stimulus. So it is in fact very simple. Your body receives a stimulus and responds to it. This adaptive response includes neurological adaptation, muscular strength, and lastly, muscular growth. Now let's learn more about this stimulus. The stimulus can be described more precisely as the intense challenging of the force output capacity of the skeletal muscle. To put this simply, once you enter a range that is close enough to muscular failure, the reps will begin to become stimulating. But at what point do reps become stimulating? At what point does the body consider its muscular force output capacity challenged? Set point varies incredibly greatly between individuals and is entirely dependent on genetic predisposition. It is the very reason for why there are half a dozen of guys in a gym that seem to have no idea what they are doing, training nowhere close to failure, and are yet double your size. By not training to muscular failure, you are gambling with the chance of just maybe reaching the stimulating field, gambling with the chance that your genetic quality might just be sufficient. To no one's surprise, having a training based on hope is not a reliable way to train. The only way to know for sure that you are stimulating growth is by reaching muscular failure. Muscular failure is ironically the only fail-safe way of stimulating growth that is entirely independent of genetic predisposition. So we now know what hypertrophy is, how it is caused, and how we can induce it, no matter how unlucky we were in the genetic lottery. The question of intensity has been answered, but what about volume? To be able to think about volume critically and objectively, one must first detach themselves from the 3 sets of 8 to 12 that have been imprinted in every modern gym enthusiast's brain. Now once this is done, we can move on. To understand the right approach to volume, one must first understand something absolutely crucial that very few people seem to understand. The act of training is catabolic. While training, an athlete is literally tearing his muscle fibers apart, putting himself under immense stress, using up all his energy storages and fatiguing both his muscles as well as his central nervous system. This is literal self-destruction, and it should be seen and respected as such. Muscle is not built in the gym. It is being scourged in the gym, and so is his central nervous system. Muscle is built in the hours and days after training, in which your central nervous system recuperates and the muscle repairs itself and adapts to the new and challenging stress of the last training session. And as we know, this adaptation expresses itself in the form of strength gain and lastly muscular growth. This is why rest is incredibly important, as it is just as crucial as training itself. So logically, we would attempt to maximize the stimulus that induces growth, and also try to minimize fatigue and damage caused by training. And how do we do this? By doing the very least as intensely as possible. We maximize the growth stimulus by maximizing intensity of effort, and we minimize damage and fatigue caused by minimizing volume. Because volume is a direct multiplier of damage and fatigue. Adding another set will always mean a 100% increase in damage and fatigue. To summarize, doing the very least as intensely as possible. This is, as we now know, absolutely logical and exactly what Mike Mensa advocated for. And you could train exactly like this, knowing you're always inducing growth, always resting enough, and at the lowest possible risk of overtraining. This sounds like the perfect approach to training, and in a sense it is. But as you can see, the video hasn't ended here. This is because there is another side to volume. Volume is not only a multiplier of damage and fatigue, it is also a multiplier of stimulus. So does this mean that more is better after all? Should we attempt to maximize volume in order to multiply the stimulus caused by intensity of effort as much as possible? The not-so-cognitively blessed athlete will be very tempted to stop his thought process here, forget about everything we previously spoke about, and go train as long as possible, only to end up in a state of gross overtraining within the matter of days. The problem we face with the stimulus multiplying property of volume is that it is not very potent when put into context with the damage and fatigue multiplying property of volume. While we may experience a 10% increase in stimulus from doing one more set, we will always experience a 100% increase in damage and fatigue from doing one more set, which, as we know, needs to be greatly respected and recovered from. Now, 10 to 1 is not really a good ratio. Another problem we face is that the stimulus multiplying property of volume is not uniform across muscle groups, meaning that with certain muscle groups, doing one more set could yield as little as a 5% increase in stimulus, while fatigue and damage receive a 100% increase nonetheless. The weak ratio between fatigue and stimulus can be more easily understood by an example. Let's say you were to perform a baseline workout consisting of 6 exercises performing 1 set per exercise. That is a total of 6 sets. If you were to however perform 2 sets per exercise, you'd experience a 5% increase in growth stimulus per extra set, and a 100% increase in damage and fatigue per extra set. In total, that is a 30% increase in growth stimulus and a 600% increase in damage and fatigue. This is a horrendous fatigue to stimulus ratio of 20 to 1, not even taking into account that the length of the workout has been doubled, and thus the quality of the workout has been impacted negatively too. So where do we go from here? If we train with the absolute minimum of volume, we miss out on the multiplication of growth stimulus, and if we train with high volume, we induce so much fatigue and cause so much damage that the state of overtraining that we will immediately put ourselves into will eventually make all the additional stimulus that we have caused worthless. The situation seems hopeless. Or does it? If one seeks for a perfect method of training, of an objective truth, a perfect amount of volume, then the situation is, in fact, devastatingly hopeless. You, dear listener, however, have the option to accept the individual and thus irrational and subjective nature of volume and opt for an approach instead. The concept of an optimal approach can be understood most easily with an analogy. As we know, volume has both properties of multiplying growth stimulus as well as multiplying damage and fatigue. What else has both positive and negative properties? A compelling example is lithium. Lithium is used as a treatment for bipolar disorder, having both the positive property of decreasing the symptoms of BPD, while also having the negative effect of causing polydipsia and polyuria. Recipients of lithium are advised to start with the lowest possible dosage of the substance and slowly increase the dosage up to the point where the positive effects are maximized, without the negative effects overpowering them. This very approach is the most logical approach to the question of volume, as is now clearly understandable. Both frequency and volume are individual and subjective matters, and in individuality there can be no absolute objectivity. Believing in the perfect volume and the perfect frequency would mean the absolute disregard of the individual nature of volume and frequency, as well as the existence of fatigue and muscular damage, and the ignorance of the importance of recuperation. But you, dear listener, are aware of this now, and can do better. In fact, I will now show you how to do so, and explain the logical approach to volume in a practical instead of theoretical manner. The question of volume can be answered with 2 sentences alone. Starting with the lowest possible volume and increasing it gradually up to the point at which the positive properties of volume are maximized, without the negative properties overpowering them. This will be done while respecting the individual response of each muscle group, as well as systemic fatigue and recovery. Always keeping in mind that one should rather train too little than too much, for the effect of overtraining can be devastating, whereas the effects of training minimally can't, and growth will always occur if intensity of effort is sufficient. To come to the last main variable of training, which is frequency, the matter is once again one of subjectivity. It is, however, luckily by far not as complex as the question of volume. one should simply rest as long as his body needs time to recover from the systemic fatigue that's been imposed on it by the most recent training session. Systemic fatigue so very often gets entirely disregarded, to the point where it seems like supposedly knowledgeable athletes aren't even aware of its existence. Not being aware of the existence of systemic fatigue, and the thus inevitable disregard of it, leads to a continuous accumulation of it, which ends in a state of overtraining. A state of overtraining which most of the time doesn't even get identified as such, but simply as being tired, not having slept enough, or eaten right, or just not feeling like it today. This self-delusion will be kept up until performance and progress in the gym stagnate, come to a halt, and ultimately regress. So the logical approach is once again, start on the low end of frequency and see if you tolerate an increase in frequency. The motto once again being, one should rather train too infrequent than too frequent, for training too frequent can be devastating, whereas training too infrequent can't. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you've got any questions left or any feedback to give, leave it down in the comment section. I would also be very happy about a subscription to the channel as well as a like on the video. In the video description you should find some sort of contact information in case you want to get in touch for coaching or advice purposes. Thank you very much and have a nice day.